On a fateful night of 11 September, the city of Derna in eastern Libya was hit by the deadliest flooding. The heavy rain from tropical storm Daniel, combined with the collapse of the two dams in the city of Derna, led to flooding that wiped out various parts of the city. This catastrophic event led to an unprecedented death and destruction of the city of Derna. In recent years, the world has witnessed the devastating impact of climate change-related disasters. From extreme weather events to desertification and the rise of sea levels, these events have caused immense suffering and destruction. But what happens when these disasters occur in countries already affected by conflict? This is Amani Africa Dispatch, our videocast on current political, governance, and peace and security affairs of continental and multilateral policy importance. The flood caused by the collapsed dam that released an estimated 30 million cubic meters of water resulted in widespread damage to infrastructure, homes, and livelihoods. The flooding has caused the deaths of more than 5,000 people, with 8,500 reported missing, and has resulted in the displacement of more than 30,000 individuals. The scale of this disaster is not merely a result of the climate change-induced unprecedented levels of heavy rain. It's also significantly affected by the ongoing conflict in the country in terms of lack of both maintenance of critical infrastructure and provision of early warning to affected communities.
The locals in Derna have been warning about it. There's been seminars. There was a study that was published by a Libyan university last year around the fragility of these infrastructures. So it is definitely an issue that is compounded by neglect, a gross mismanagement of public funds, public theft, corruption, and conflict.
Conflict disrupts essential infrastructures and services, making communities more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Conflict results in neglected maintenance, leaving fragile infrastructures vulnerable to be easily overwhelmed by climate-induced extreme weather conditions. Conflict diverts resources and attention away from disaster preparedness and response efforts. This can hinder conflict-affected countries' effectiveness in addressing potential threats and providing timely assistance. That is what happened in Derna. Like many parts of Libya, the conflict that unraveled since 2011 following the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi diverted resources and political attention away from services in the country, including maintenance of critical infrastructure. This left essential systems ill-prepared to handle and respond to the sudden influx of the tropical storm Daniel. The situation in Derna highlighted the significant impact of conflict in aggravating climate change-related disasters. However, this incident in Derna is not an isolated case. Other African countries facing prolonged conflicts are also at a high risk of climate change-related disasters. While the famine in Madagascar was reported as the first climate change-induced famine, its occurrence would not have been possible without governance failure. Similarly, the harder farmer violence in parts of West Africa and the Sahel has become increasingly frequent and fatal due to governance failure and conflict. This is occasioned by climate change-induced conflict and the rising depletion of resources, including pasture land. The disaster that befallen Derna, along with other various cases, demonstrates how conflicts and governance failures can engender lack of preparedness and effective response to climate change. This highlights that climate security nexus is not one-directional. Derna is a reminder that fragility, governance failures, and conflict are capable of transforming climate-induced extreme weather conditions into catastrophes. The discussion of adaptation to climate change in situations of conflict, fragility, or peace building is largely absent or minimal. According to a report by the United Nations Development Programme, none of the global climate change instruments, such as the Paris Agreement or the Kyoto Protocol of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, addresses the issue of conflict, fragility, or peace and security. The Climate Response for Sustaining Peace initiative, spearheaded by the co-presidency of Egypt in 2022, marks the first time that the issue of conflict and peace is brought to the discussion within the framework of COP.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome you today at COP27, the COP of implementation, to launch the COP27 Presidency Initiative, Climate Response to Sustaining Peace.
So, what should be the way forward? One of the pillars of the Climate Response for Sustaining Peace initiative is to enhance the connection between climate adaptation and peace building. Not any less important and deserving of urgent attention is to address the fact that conflict-affected and fragile countries receive the least from global climate finance. Over the past 3 years, African countries received only $16 billion in climate finance, while the annual gap from 2020 to 2030 amounts to $1,288 billion.
The architecture is set up in a manner that if you borrow, it will be difficult for you to pay. We need a conversation, and a very candid conversation, and we are saying this in all honesty, around how do we get concessional funding.
Fragile countries face even more challenges accessing climate finance compared to non-fragile contexts. Recent reports show that countries in fragile settings receive only 1/80 of per capita climate financing compared to non-fragile countries. But Derna's story also invites critical questions, including what about the impacts of conflict or the lack of good governance in aggravating climate change-related disasters? Governance failures and conflicts undercut and lead to the neglect of the implementation of measures for ensuring climate resilience and reducing the adverse impact of climate change-induced disasters, as demonstrated by the recent dam disaster in Libya. This also highlights the necessity for integration of preparedness and adaptation strategies and conflict response measures. In the urgent battle against climate change, policymakers must recognize that discussions like COP, devoid of conversations on peace and security, risk the exclusion of conflict-affected fragile regions, with unintended catastrophic consequences on the lives and livelihoods of people in those regions. This is Amani Africa Dispatch.